All right, but let's do the talk. I can talk about animals for an hour or two, but that's not what you're here for, right? My name's Richard Campbell, and I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Oh, wow, okay, bunch. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002 before the word podcast existed. That's why we call it an internet audio talk show. We're not that clever to come up with a name like podcast. And I started running this radio back in 2007, more aimed at the sysadmin because I didn't like the shows at that time. And then for a brief interval, we made a third show called The Tablet Show when we weren't sure if .NET rocked anymore. And we didn't know where to put mobile and tablet content. And so, but the Tablet Show eventually rolled back into .NET Rocks. And what you're seeing now this hour is a Geek Out. So I make these Geek Out episodes on .NET Rocks. There's about 100 of them. There was a time where I made one every month because I had way too much time on my hands. These days, I only make a couple, 2 or 3 a year. Typically around Christmas time, I'll do a recap on the state of space in the world and the current energy production in the world, how we're shifting towards low carbon approaches to making energy and so forth. That being said, this is the first Geek Out I've written as a talk before I was a podcast. So I have not done this Undersea Cable Network as a podcast yet. I don't know if I will, probably. But this was asked for by a number of folks who said, could you explain more of this to me and what's going on with it? So it was a fun excuse for me to sort of get my head around what I thought I knew. Because a lot of us have thoughts. We know there's these undersea cables, and there's a lot of them. At this point, there's about 2 million kilometers of cable laid under the sea just for data. We're laying somewhere between 15 and 30 new cables a year. Each one of those cables moves about 100 to 200 terabits per second. So we have a huge amount of data capacity spread under the ocean. Pretty much every time you send an email or anything that is going to leave a continent, it's going to go under the sea. It's the vast majority, 97, 98% of all data travels on the Undersea Cable Network. I know we're all very excited about satellites, but the reality is they're barely 1%. And really, we're just talking about Starlink, right? And it's just a capacity problem. You're dealing with microwaves being transmitted upwards a couple of 100 kilometers. You can only push so much bandwidth through there. The current contemporary Starlink satellite, the V2 Mini, moves about 60 gigabits across multiple antennas. So you can't have 60 gigs to yourself, but it covers multiple. And there's about 7,000 of them. So you figure the total capacity of Starlink around the world is about 420 terabits, which is roughly 2 cables. So when you think there's nearly 600 cables out there, admittedly, some of them are older, like we're definitely progressing in the amount of data that we're moving in. The cables last somewhere between 15 and 25 years. We just can't even imagine how much data is being hauled through those things all of the time. And the satellite network can't even come close and probably never will. So if your question was, is this all going to be satellites? The answer is no. You can go. And we've been laying cables under the water for a long time. So if we go back to the olden days, before these modern times, the first telegraph cable under the water was across the English Channel in the 1850s. We didn't actually try and lay transatlantic cables until 1858 was the first attempt. It lasted 3 weeks. Because right away its signal quality wasn't good enough, so they kept turning up the voltage until they burned it up. Well done. The first really reliable cable was not until 1866. And right away, they're marketing it as what used to be 2 weeks, like 2 weeks to send a letter across the ocean, came 2 minutes if you're willing to pay telegraph rates to be able to go under the ocean. And that stays like this map you're actually looking at is a map from 1901 from Eastern Telegraph's network. So this is just telegraphy. In those 30, 40 years, they laid a lot of cable fairly quickly, pretty primitive cable, but telegraph was important. The first of the telephone cables doesn't come until the 1950s, and it was cleverly named the Transatlantic Telephone, or TAT-1 cable. So this was a venture between the US, UK, and Canada, running from Scotland over to Newfoundland. They laid 2 cables, one in 1955, one in 1956. Got it operational in 56, and it can handle 35 telephone calls at the same time. So that was the capacity. And it was, in 1956, it was $12 for 3 minutes of a call, roughly about $100 for a 3-minute call. And that wire ran until the 1970s. Now we're up to, I think the current generation of that cable is TAP 20. So they do keep laying new ones and improving the technology along the way. Because this is just a bundle of copper, essentially, wrapped in different layers. So you got a central copper core. It's got a series of sheathings so that it can actually pass electricity back and forth. This is all just electrical. And then various kinds of sealants, armor, and coatings to try and protect that cable. But in the end, it's not that big. And even then, the signals are fairly weak. So at a regular interval, you have to insert a repeater along the bottom. So for TAP 1, there were 51 of these repeaters. So they're taking the voltage of the outer sheathing and using that to amplify the signals for the telephone through these amplifiers that are underwater. So these are roughly every 70 kilometers or so, they would put another one of these in the line. And that's how this worked. And they just kept laying more and more of them. They got cleverer with multiplexing and so forth with data, but the real revolution in undersea cables comes with fiber optics in the 1980s. So now we're going to be able to move data using lasers and glass. Now, making a fiber optic cable is a complicated process. It's not that easy to get glass to cooperate. It's a bunch of different layers, and I'll walk you through some of this. And these are in micrometers, or millionths of a meter, or thousandths of a millimeter, if you're doing the math that way. So they're pretty thin. You know, typically the inner core is only going to be about 50 micrometers if we're multimodal, which is we're using multiple frequencies of laser light. A single modal fiber, which are the original types, are very, very narrow. 9 micrometers is really quite a tiny little piece of glass. The reason for the size and variation is that light comes in widths, right? Light is a set of frequencies measured in nanometers. So your red-shifted lights are in the 750 or so range, and then up down into the violets, which are down to 400 nanometers. And so they bounce differently inside the glass. So you can use different frequencies to move more data in it, but you have to have enough room, right? Like in theory, it moves at the speed of light. It's just that it doesn't move very straight. So it takes longer than the speed of light to travel down these cables because it's bouncing along in the inside of the cable. But they're glass, and they need to be very reflective. And so you have to make very pure glass with high reflectivity for different frequencies. And so the process of making these is extraordinary. And I've had the opportunity to tour the Corning labs where they actually do what they call pores to make these. So they start with a thing they call a preform or a billet. This will be a large piece of very pure silicon chloride that is maybe 2 to 3 meters long and half a meter wide. And it's extremely pure, and then they'll hollow it out and dope the inside of it with different compounds to be able to increase the reflectivity and get it to the style they want. But this is a big fat piece of glass that they'll sit into a crucible and heat up. And that glass will literally drip out of the bottom of it into a long line. So they build a tower, and this is 30 meters high. These are large. They're inside of buildings. They're very carefully controlled environment. And they call this a drawing tower. And the glass will literally drip out of that crucible and be measured very precisely, have cladding layers added to it until it gets to the bottom of the tower where it'll literally be picked up on a capstan and wound into the glass. And then after they're done, they will measure it to see how well they did. So when you talk about different grades of fiber optic cable, it's often just they make a bunch and see how they do. These days, the systems are way more controlled and very consistent. You can make billeted glass up to 10,000 kilometers straight. It'll take you about a week to make that. And this continuous stream running 24 hours a day with the preform just slowly melting and pouring down and being wound in. So when you're going to lay an undersea cable, typically you order the cable to specifications. You decide on a frequency set, the number of strands, type of cable, and so forth, and then it'll be made to order. Now that whole drawing process only does these 2 inner layers, the actual fiber core and the cladding layer, which is the reflective layer. Then you'll have additional coatings on top of it. It depends on the type of cable. This is an example of a typical, what we call an indoor cable, what we call or a tight buffer cable, where the wrappings are compressed very tightly around the fiber to protect it, but it doesn't have a lot of tolerance, right? You know, if you ever played with fiber optic cable in a lab, you'll find out if you bend it, it doesn't work anymore. So it has very limited radiuses and how it can turn, and it's all the tight cladding. For undersea cables, because they move so much, they use a different approach called a loose cladding technique. And so in the loose cladding technique, there'll be multiple strands of the cladded fiber. So it's just got the two layers on it. It's only maybe 120, 130 micrometers across, put in loosely into tubes filled with water repellent gel. And so that gives the fiber a bit more flexibility to move, and we put more fibers into it. Now, there's not a lot of good pictures of these styles of fiber, so I've actually, that aren't licensable. So this is a picture of a 48-strand loose clad fiber cable. You would not typically put this under the sea. 48 strands is too many. They're typically 6s or 12s. We're starting to do 24s. Because again, you need to amplify these light signals on a routine basis. So each one of these fibers needs to go through an amplifier and be boosted. And so 48 is a lot. But you're still talking about something narrower than your thumb, right? These individual strands are thinner than hair. And when bundled up like this, it still doesn't add up to very much size. And then you have to protect it somehow. And so we put different kinds of armor around these fibers, depending on where we're running it. So at the simplest level, just a lightweight cladding on the end there. You see only 17 millimeters across, so the size of a coin. They're not particularly big. And they get bigger as we put different levels of armor on top of it. Now, why do you need to armor them? Well, it's where the cable's being laid in terms of what danger it's actually in. And the dangerous parts for undersea cables is close to shore. So we will heavily armor the cable close to shore. And then as water gets deeper, they'll actually decrease the armor. So when you order a cable to specification for a pull like this, you'll actually have different amounts of armor in different points along the cable. Along the seafloor at deep water, you're probably not going to armor it very much at all. It'll be under a lightweight armor. Depends on the amount of tectonic issues you have. Like, what's the chance of earthquake? What's the chance of landslide? How much do we need to protect the cable in that respect? But your main issue with these fibers is in the shore areas where they're likely to be hit by trawlers or anchors or other nasty things that will really do damage to them. And so these fibers then go into digital repeaters. And some of these repeaters get huge, so person for scale. But you are literally breaking all those fibers out of the cable and then running them through optical pump lasers. The power comes along in the cable as well. So we're pumping electricity. You saw in all of these strands, you see those bands of copper. That's for carrying the electricity to power the repeaters down the line. So electricity is boosted along each step, and then these repeaters are used to boost the signal back up, because bit by bit, as it bounces around inside of the fiber, it's losing part of its signal. The reflectivity is not perfect. It's good, but it's not perfect. And so over time, the signals get vaguer and vaguer. And so running it back through a pump laser brings it back up to its sharp resolution, and it can continue boost. And so depending on the density of the data set, every 50 to 100 kilometers, you'll have an amplifier like this. So when you've got a 10,000 kilometer wire, you're laying it down inside of a ship in a big drum. Again, you can see the fiber itself is pretty small, right? They're relatively narrow, so you can lay a lot of wire in there. But the amplifiers, repeaters are integrated into it. So after about 100 kilometers or 70 kilometers of wire being laid down, then they'll actually go out of the box, lay down, include one of these repeaters, then go back into the box, lay another 70, 80 kilometers on and out of the box. So what you're seeing here is the repeater stacks. So these are already wired in, but between each one of these is about 70 to 80 kilometers worth of fiber optic cable, over and over again. So these are specialized ships for doing just this kind of work, that they literally load these huge spools of fiber with their repeaters integrated in them to put them on the bottom. Now, I'd be remiss, we're mostly talking about data cabling because there's lots of different kinds of cable that run. I'll mention one of the most common ones you'll often see, which is primarily for wind power these days. This is the three-phase cable, so 3 big copper cores for taking electricity off of a generator from a wind turbine. They also have a data cable in them. They'll always have at least one fiber optic cable for communications. There are more cables in this, and I could probably further into it. In fact, we're in Denmark, where you have one of the coolest undersea cables that exists today. It is a superconductive DC connection between Denmark and Norway for sharing electricity. So when Denmark's making lots of wind power, more than you need, then power flows to Norway, through that line, and because it's a DC line, it doesn't have to be synchronized with Norway's power grid, and they're pumping liquid nitrogen through it the whole time to keep it cool under the ocean. And then when the wind dies down and you don't have enough power, then the Norwegians open up their dams more, run their hydroelectric harder, and flow the power the other way. And so you share like civilized people. All right, let's talk about a contemporary cable, and I'll sort of we'll start with Google's Donante cable, which was laid in 2020. So this is a 6,600 kilometer long cable. Typical economics for these kinds of cables, and they're generally owned by telephone companies or these days the tech giants. So Google's just laying their own these days. About 150 to as much as 500 million for a cable, depending on how long it is and what difficult terrain it's going to go through. You're going to get about 20 years of it, maybe 25. This particular cable was 6,600 kilometers long, so it's going from Reston, Virginia to France. So that's Virginia Beach to St. Hilaire de Roos. It has 12 fibers inside of it. So a total capacity of about 250 terabits per second. Okay, and we think in bits because there's a bunch of different constructs here, but you can get an estimate that that's just a lot of data. This is a very contemporary cable. Admittedly, it's already 5 years old. Like, we have better cables. We can go faster than this now. It took less than a year to lay. I would point out the 250 terabit, that one cable, represents more data capacity than all the cables laid in the 90s. Right? So we definitely bumped up with more multiplexing, pushing more data through each fiber, as well as we put more fibers in and can break them out and put them down. So this ship that laid this was the Reliance, which is operated by a dedicated company called Subcom. You contract to them for laying cables. That's all these guys do. And I showed you a picture of the big spool inside of the ship that holds the majority of the cable. There's a bunch of steps here, so you have to start at a beachhead, the initial point, and then they'll bury that cable as they lay it down. So they have a big plow that they put onto the beach and then drag down. It'll push the cable between 1 meter and 4 meters, and new plows bury deeper because anchors seem to be digging them up better these days. And they'll bury that in the seafloor up to about 200 meters. It'll be between 1 and 4 meters, typically 1 meter deep. And that works out to about 200 meters of depth or so. So it depends on the kind of seafloor that you're around, but they basically want to get you off the continental shelf before they drop down. And that will be armored cable. That's the cable that's in the most danger. And so they'll put heavy armor around that cable depending on the risks and how much they're willing to spend there. And then once it gets to the deeper water, the plow gets pulled up and they're just dropping the cable in the water as they go along. You're going about 10 kilometers an hour. So this is not a real fast process. It will take weeks, months to lay a 6,600 kilometer cable down. But it also means you're only hitting the repeaters every 6 to 10 hours. So realistically, the cable's spooling out of that drum, and then they have a crane that picks up the next repeater in the line and holds it as it drops over the side in line. And just working 24 hours a day, putting along. If storms get bad enough, they can actually hold up. There's always a danger of breaking the cable if forces get too high. The current generations of ships are very precisely controlled. They have thrusters all around them, so they can basically hold in place and move at an exact rate, even when the currents and storms are trying to push them further. So they do their best to try and keep that cable from getting damaged in the process of moving it along. The shore point is they typically call the beach manhole. So this will be literally on the beach. They'll dig down where that cable is going to be laid, and they'll pour a concrete box around that cable, and that's sort of the line they call we're terminating from the wet side to the dry side. Inside this concrete box is going to be something really sexy like this. Just a rack with a termination point. They literally have the cable coming out of the sea and buried in the beach, 3 or 4 meters down, and then coming into this box. They'll then terminate it and then patched into another set of cables that will go to the dry side. So not far from the beach, but inland enough that you're on regular power grid and those sorts of things. You'll have your dry terminator. And most of what's in the dry terminator is power, because you're pumping power back into that wire to operate it. That little rack in the center there, that's all the data handling, because it's not that hard to break out the data. From there, you'll go into big subswitches and the rest of the distribution. So beach manhole to cable landing station, and the cable landing station does the power side. That's also will do a bunch of the testing. and how they evaluate when cables get damaged. So they're able to send signals down to measure the efficiency of the cable, and so they can detect damage, and cables get damaged. There's a bunch of ways that cables get damaged. The most common is earthquakes and landslides. So there's tectonics under the sea, things move around. Sometimes you get cables damaged deep in the central part of the ocean, and sometimes you get damage close to shore. Close to shore, it's trawlers. So these are bottom-dragging fishing boats. Many countries have banned them now. They're basically like clear-cutting the ocean, and they do have a tendency to snag cables. And then anchor damage. And we'll talk a lot about anchor damage because it's been in the news lately, and folks are very interested in what all that looks like. So there's a different set of ships for fixing damaged cables. It depends on the kind of damage that we're dealing with. So this is a splicer ship, the Intrepid. So this is a ship for a deep water repair. So you've had a landslide along the Atlantic fault line, which is the point roughly in the center of the Atlantic where we have a volcanic eruptions and literally the ocean is getting bigger and pushing against the tectonic plates. Those are areas where you occasionally will have landslides, and the landslide drops the right way, damages the cable. And so out will go a ship like the Intrepid, and it will be given an estimate of where the damage is based on reflectivity in the fiber optic cable. So they send signals down the cable that gives them a guess within a few nautical miles of roughly where the cable was broken. They'll send the ship out that particular point. They'll then pulse the electricity in the cable and measure the interferometry on that to get a better signal of where the power is failing. And then they'll send an ROV down to actually find the cable itself. Closer to shore, they won't bother with a ship this big. These are expensive machines. They'll use splice barges, and splice barges are good for calmer water, near shore water. They're a little bit more maneuverable. They have a lot of jets on them, so they can position directly over a cable, and they can pull up the damaged portion of the cable and do service on it. So typically, these days, they use an ROV, a crawler like this, and they'll literally search for the cable on the bottom. They're reading the electrical signals that you're sending to it so they can finally maneuver onto the cable. Depending on where it is, they might need to dig it up or not. They have a limited amount of ability to do work on the cable underwater. Their main job is to connect a lifter to the cable. So once they've located the cable, a spar will be sent down onto the cable, and then this ROV will actually connect that cable onto the spar. Then the ROV gets lifted with the crane, and then the cable itself will get lifted. So the spar stops the cable from overbending so we don't damage it, and you pull the entire cable up onto a ship and put it into a splice room. That's the splice room. Let's see if I can get this to work today. Come on, buddy. That is the splice room right there. So this is actually already a splice cable. You can see it's already been wrapped and stuff. I didn't have a good picture of them bringing up a damaged cable, but they'll lift that cable and they'll put it, the top of the splice room opens up and they'll drop the cable into the splice room. And then a group of folks will work sometimes for days to cut away all of the damaged cable parts, identify all the fibers, then they'll re-splice the fibers. They put a splice box around the entire thing. They attach up the armor to each end of the splice box, and they re-splice all of the fibers, seal the whole thing back up, close it up into a new unit, lift it back out of the splice room, put it back into the ocean. Now, if it's closer to shore, then they're going to use a plow again and try and bury the cable. So it's a whole other set of processes. We've now dug all that cable up. We'll then go down to a point where it's surfaced. And we'll re-drag it, trying to put it deeper under the ground to try and protect it from being hit some more. Does this make sense? This is the contemporary cable designs now. They're all armored. They have various ways of doing splicing. There's not a lot of variation anymore. Like the cables pretty much all look the same when we're talking about data cabling, just because we can pack so much data through them now. These 240 and 480 terabit cables are really, really fast. So let's talk about the problems you have with cables. And the problem is that we're trying to keep them underwater, so we run them through certain difficult points, like the area around Port Said and the Red Sea. So this is a way for us to run cables from Europe, across the Mediterranean, and then down into the Indian Ocean and around to the to Southeast Asia. The longest undersea cables in the world are those run. The ME3 run is from England to Japan. It's a 10,000 kilometer run. And that cable just got damaged again. And it got damaged around Port Said. So literally a couple of days ago, this happened. So anchor drags are the usual problem around these port areas, these locus points. And they kind of come in waves sometimes. Like, this doesn't look like Houthis. This looks like a ship anchored in the wrong spot, which does happen. All of these cables are marked on nautical maps. You're supposed to stay away from them, but people anchor in the wrong spot. And then you're not supposed to drag anchor either, but apparently there was a storm. Normally a ship is stopped, puts down an anchor, and then backs away from its anchor because it's actually held in place by its chain. Anchor's never supposed to move. But you get a big enough storm that it can actually pull the ship to actually drag the anchor. That's when you get into damage situations in the traditional form. This got particularly acute in Southeast Asia around the 2008 time period. I know this is really hard to even look at, but look at the concentration of cables going through the Strait of Malacca here and near Singapore. So if anybody remembers 2008, there was a bit of an economic downturn then. And one of the things that happens when you have an economic downturn is you just don't need as many ships. But finding moorage for big cargo ships and tankers and things is hard and expensive. So the alternative is you just sort of dump your ship. You park it somewhere relatively safe with decent weather, and your team takes off in the night. It takes about 2 or 3 years to go through the paperwork to get a ship removed. So as long as within a couple of years, things turn around and you're going to need that ship again, then you sneak your team back in, get back on the ship and take off, you're fine. So 2008, a whole bunch of ships get parked around Singapore, abandoned, and they parked them over all these undersea cables, and then the storms came and tore up the cables. And they couldn't relocate the ships, they damaged the cables, so we mangled the internet for a couple of years there until mysteriously all these ships start disappearing. And they're actually able to get in and repair them. The more common case going on right now, or that recently, is the whole Baltic Sea set of incidents, which may be relevant to you since the Danes were directly involved. I was just reading through all of these and realizing how, with a flurry that happened here. So going back to November of 2024, a bulk carrier called the Yipeng 3, Chinese bulk carrier, had left Russia loaded with fertilizer, and a couple of days later, it passed close to Gotland, and the BCS east-west cable went dead. Now, it's nighttime, nobody really knows what's going on. Curiously, shortly after that, the Yipeng turns off its AIS, its automated tracking transponder, so that you know where it is, and it's off for about 8 hours or so, and in that time, another cable, a cable running between Finland and Germany, the Sea Lion cable, also goes dead. Then suddenly the AIS comes back on, and it was a Danish public broadcaster that sent a drone out to that ship and saw that one of its anchors was down. And kind of let the authorities know, and it was this is a picture of that Danish patrol ship that came to the Yipeng and basically, stopped it, and they anchored outside of Swedish waters, but in the economic zone, and stayed for several weeks. There's a whole lot of conversation going on with China, and with Finland, and Germany, and Denmark, and Sweden, and ultimately in December, a set of investigators, including Chinese investigators that have been flown in, and Swedish, Finns, and Danes, board the ship and spend several hours there, interrogate the crew and so forth. And then on December 21st, the ship went off on its way again. Apparently it was an accident. Somehow they let the anchor fall, mysteriously turned off the AIS for a few hours, ripped across 2 cables. So, a few weeks later in December, another ship, this time one of the Russian oil tankers. This is part of what they call the shadow fleet because the Russians aren't allowed to trade oil anymore legally on the market. So a Russian tanker going somewhere, loaded with unleaded gasoline, drags anchor across the DS-Link 2 power cable and a couple of ELISA data cables for a Finnish company. That evening, the Finns show up the same day. A Finnish offshore boat intercepts with a, quote, special intervention force. Oh, Finns don't have a lot of sense of humor about this sort of thing. So they basically send the ship into anchor around Finland and impound the ship. Then they send submarines down and look at the cables and say, well, these definitely look like they were dragged on an anchor, but there was no anchor on the Eagle. It was missing its anchor entirely. So they go find the anchor, find it at the end of a long drag line where the two cables were damaged. The Finns then charge the crew, the captain and a couple of officers, seize the fuel to repay for damages, and ask the Russians if they'd like their ship back. They eventually come and get it. The damage is in tens of millions. It'll take 3 months to fix the data cables and half a year to fix the power cable. Power cables are very tricky. And then the next month, the cargo vessel Vincennes, which is a Bahamian-registered heavy bulk carrier, mysteriously drags an anchor across a Latvian-Sweden cable. And this time the Swedes get in the action and immediately impound the ship and charge the crew, prove that the cable's been damaged by an anchor drag again, and seize the cargo and resell it to pay off the costs. But they were all accidents, you understand. Here's the fun part. Guess how many anchor drag damaged cables there's been in the Baltic since the two ships were seized? None. Accidents. And the other part of this is that then with the Swedish and Finns now part of NATO, NATO formed a group called the Baltic Sentry, and to this day, every ship that moves anywhere in the Baltic gets photographed by drones. They check their anchors, they check their state as they leave port, and they check them as they're traveling. So made it very clear that anchor drags won't be tolerated anymore. And like I said, mysteriously they stopped. So now the question is, what's just happened in the Red Sea? Was that actually an anchor drag or some other activity going on? Nobody really knows. It literally has just been a couple of days since all this actually went on. Meantime, on the other side of the ocean in Taiwan, mysteriously, two cables running between Taiwan and the islands immediately off the coast of Taiwan, the Matsu Islands, have had cable cuts. Ships have been dragging anchor there. Chinese ships. There's not a lot of energy around what to do about this at this particular point. The Taiwanese are talking about buying huge amounts of Starlink as alternative connectivity, at least initially, because this is a different area to work in a very challenging circumstance. But you can see that this technology is starting to be weaponized. It's not that hard. The other thing, now we're starting to build plows that'll bury cables 4 meters under the bottom. That all depends on the kind of bottom you have as to whether or not you can do that, but that'll make it tough for anchors to get down that deep. And it's expensive to dig like that. You damage plows and things, but try and protect the cables. That's kind of the path that we're on. So where are we with all this? We kind of recognize here that the undersea cable network's not optional. We count on the internet completely. The real expansion in the undersea cable network came as a byproduct of the dot-com boom. If you were around back then, in the late 90s and 2000, a huge amount of money was spent laying cables down. There was a couple of companies that were formed specifically to add a bunch more fiber on the undersea cable network. And then the dot-com bust happened in 2001, and all those companies went broke, but they had already laid the fiber down. And so suddenly all that fiber was 10 cents on the dollar, and really led to why we have call centers in India now, because we have such cheap data connections everywhere on the planet for laying all of that fiber. It's kind of a silly way to go about things. So, a lot of investors lost a lot of money. And a lot of fiber's still missing. There are beach manholes and termination points that people don't know where the cables go. I have friends who are in the business of trying to find these cables. So they've got a termination point that's like, I wonder where the other end is. And so they've sort of started to build a map of lost manholes and things, and they put senders on the ends of the cables, and then literally go to the other side of the ocean and find these other manholes. So once in a while they recover a cable. There's also lots of cables, terrestrial cables in that situation too. Just terminations in basements and corners and things where people just don't know where they are. Companies go out of business, and the crews, they don't know what they finished or didn't finish. They didn't get paid, so they're not willing to tell anybody. And yeah, they just keep being turned up one way or the other. But I hope it conveyed to you the idea that there's way more cable than you think, and it moves far more data than you realize. And there's really no alternatives. Like, this is the best technology we have for moving this amount of data. You can't pass it across the airwaves at the same rate. You know, I showed you that map in 1901 of all those telegraph cables. That was the same year that Marconi first did a transatlantic radio communication. He used Morse code, or a signaling system across the Atlantic, which you thought would have ended cables. Oh, now we can just do it through the air. This is much less expensive. Just put up antennas, except that you just can't move the same amount of conversations, right? There's only so much airwaves, so much space, and so many frequencies. So you're limited to the amount of data you can move through the air compared to what you can move through a cable. And today, we make that more and more true. So these next generation cables that are starting to emerge, they're not really changing the technology all that much. The lasers only work in the visible spectrum. Going outside of that spectrum doesn't make a lot of sense. So we can cram a certain number of color frequencies down each cable, each one doing multiplex data. So we're increasing the density per fiber. We're also getting better at building smaller pump diode lasers, so we can put more fibers per cable inside of a given repeater. So we're starting to see 48 strand and possibly 96 strands that will actually be repeated inside of a single casing. So that's when you're going to start seeing petabit cables moving per cable through there. Also, a byproduct of this is that a byproduct of additional cable needs is we're looking at the effects of climate change to open up the Arctic. Before 2014, if anybody's paying attention to what happened in 2014, there was initiatives between the US and Russia and Canada and Sweden to run cables around the Arctic Circle, just other routes to get shorter cables run through. But a lot of those conversations have been stopped, at least for now. But we're looking at whatever routes we can lay more fiber down into, just because it creates other connection points and allows us to move more data as necessary. There's one cable called the Far North Fiber Express cable that's supposed to connect Europe to Japan by going up through the Arctic Sea and coming back down again. It's just very challenging to transit anything close to Russian waters at this particular moment. And with that, I think that's all I got for you guys today. I hope this was useful. I'm fascinated by the undersea cable system, and I hope you are too. Thanks for your time. Questions? Sir, ma'am, sorry. Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. That was fascinating. The first question I have is the same type of cable that transports data and power? You showed like a picture that different receivers, but is it the same type of cable that, or is it different, and how do they differ from each other?
When you're actually going to move meaningful amounts of electricity, like there's electricity running through the data cables to power the repeaters, but when you're going to move electricity from a wind turbine, then you need large cores of copper or even larger cores of aluminum to move the electricity. Fundamentally, the cables are wrapped the same way, but their cables are actually way more expensive. Copper is expensive when you get up to the double aughts for the kind of electricity that's coming out of those big wind turbines. That's big pieces of copper, and they need 3 of them. So they're expensive, and they're very dangerous to work on. They carry a lot of impedant power. And so, for example, when that Estonian cable was cut in the Baltic Sea, and it was a power cable, that was actually a power synchronization cable for distributing power between Estonia and Finland. You have to disconnect that cable on both ends and then pull it up, cut out all the damaged bits, and then relay the copper into it as well. It's much more difficult to patch. And you need those things to be very, very sealed. When you move that much electricity through a cable, you have a lot of electrolysis effects, so it will actually destroy itself if it's not perfectly sealed. The salt water is ideal for creating conduction to actually disintegrate the cable. The data cables are simpler in a lot of respects. Like, glass is awesome. It doesn't react with anything. You know, I didn't really get into the surveillance side of this, but back when we were using copper for transmitting data, it was very easy during the Cold War, they would clamp sensors over top of the cable and could actually read the signals because they create a field. Fiber doesn't do that. If you want to actually intercept fiber, you have to cut the cable. You have to get into the line. And so it's visible to anybody using the cable, or the monitors on the cable. If anybody's, I'm not saying they're not doing it. It's pretty clear that they are. That there are certain countries in the world here that have submarines capable of going down onto those cables and splicing into them to be able to read the signals from them. Although one would argue there's easier ways to go about that. Just put up a social media site. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah.
The second question is, like you said, like some of these cables run on international waters, right? And this brings like a lot of geopolitical challenges.
Yes.
So how does the demand comes like to your business? Like, how do they find out now we need one more cable because we're running out of throughput?
Well, we know what the capabilities of our current cables are. We know how much data we're moving. So eventually you start to get more latency. You know, one of the things that's interesting about contemporary transmission protocols is that they work really well until the cable's close to capacity. Then they start having more collisions, and so the error rate on the cable goes way up. And so you limit the amount of data to stay below the error rate. So once you've got all your cables running close to the data error rate limit, you know you need more cable. But you can generally project as data load goes up when that's going to happen, because it takes you, it's 2 or 3 years of planning between, hey, we need a cable, and the cable's actually up and running. You can lay it in a year, but you do have to do a certain amount of licensing, and you've got to figure out your landing points and so forth. Like, none of that is easy, and making that cable almost takes longer than laying it.
Okay. Then you notify the customer, like, hey, your cable is running out of.
Yeah.
It's like I come from software, so it's like sometimes it's hard to justify demand because people have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So I guess like maybe your customers don't understand how the cable is or how the throughput is.
Yeah, I think most of this is invisible to the average user of any of these things. Like, for the most part, people don't realize that every email you've ever sent went on the bottom of the sea at some point. Like, that's just the reality of how things move around on the internet. And this is what telcos are for, right? Like, this is kind of their business, is providing sufficient bandwidth for all those things. Recognizing that, like Starlink and the like, they're last mile solutions. They're not backbone solutions. So it's hard to get it's one thing to get the fiber under the ocean and to the shore, and maybe to the city, but getting it out to people's homes is hard, and it's expensive. And so we come up with alternate solutions to get to those last mile pieces, and that's typically our bandwidth constraint. And more cities, and I think we're in one of them, have fiber run to homes that are actually fast, gigabit caliber connections. And then, you think about all your gigabit caliber connections around the neighborhood, combining into these terabit connections that flow into the ocean. So it's just a math problem. We can project fairly well how people are going to use. We've had serious problems with the network. The biggest one was 2020. When we sent everybody home, we just about tipped over the internet. Like, people don't realize how close we came to tipping the internet. Remember when the EU asked Netflix very politely to turn off 4K? We were afraid of tipping over the internet. We were running out of bandwidth. We shifted all of those backbones that were running into offices were quiet, and now all the residentials were busy during the day, and they just weren't built for it. And so, literally we were getting close to constraint. And once those things start to unravel, they're hard to get resynced. So if it had broken, we would have had many more problems. And literally, the backbone companies got together and said, how can we decrease the bandwidth load? And one of the easy ones was Netflix's 4K, because it's just a lot of data, and people can live with 1080p for a couple of years. But you also see when these cable cuts come, we continue to function, right? Like, it's remarkable. This networking technology was built to survive nuclear war, right? The Americans developed it back in the 60s as a redundant networking approach where individual nodes could be destroyed, the system would keep working. They just grew it out. Eventually, they lost interest in it and made their own version, the MILNet, and let the ARPANET go to the universities. And that's how it stayed until the 90s, with this idea of commercializing it, that then Netscape and the dot-com boom, and look what happened to your job. And we've, of course, increased the bandwidth ever since. Once we agreed on a set of protocols that could work for everybody, we just kept building it out further and further. And now here we are. Sir? So if you look at what Google did, literally laying that cable between the US and France, they hired a company in France that deals with the France side of the fiber. They hired a company in America that deals with the American side of the fiber. Then they hired a company that does the cables and testing, right? So it's always a collective group of entities. And most of those companies know how to work with each other already. They've done it before. And so each of those companies then knows how to get their legislation, get their licensing through for what's required. This stuff's way simpler than data centers, right? Because it's not that much power. This is kilowatts of power, not megawatts of power. So you're not putting a lot of stress on infrastructure for doing that. They definitely, from an environmental point of view, are creating zones where cables will be laid, because that's also areas where you cannot fish. And often they'll use those as protected zones for fisheries, because it's good for the fish, right? Once those cables run to the bottom, nobody bothers them anymore. But they don't want anybody fishing in that area. They don't want anybody going that area. So they'll often put those things in reserve areas. So you will be told by the destination country, this is where you're allowed to lay your cable. You've got to figure out, can you get to your station point to the broader network? And you're going to need space and power and equipment for all of that. But these are not... They're not huge problems. They're just expensive. It's several $100 million. But from a Google perspective, like, they've got the cash, right? Like, this is not expensive, and this is why they've started to get into them. But I would say this: for the most part, the cables that the big tech giants have laid, they've put them into the broader network. Like, you would think, oh, Google laid this cable, it's just between Google data centers, and that's not actually true. Because if they put them in the broader network, then they own a certain amount of bandwidth on the network, which means when they have a problem with their cable, they can use other people's cables because they were using theirs. So there's these collective agreements between the various telcos for sharing cable capacity, so that when you do have an outage, it's not a big deal to route onto the other cables. And they do actually pay per byte. So, largely we don't pay per byte as consumers because we get really irritable when that happens. But under the hood, the greater network largely pays per byte. And so, of course, we're talking in terabytes, but most of these are traded bytes. So it's like, I ran this many terabytes over your cable because you ran this many terabytes over my cable, and so forth. And what comes out in the wash. It's not, in the end, the biggest set of issues. It's also not profitable enough for it to be its own business, right? This is very much as a utility. They're very low margin businesses, and so it's only when you have added services on top of it that you're interested in it, right? Like, Google and Microsoft have gotten into laying cable because they don't want to wait for the telcos to do it. So they lay the cable so they have the bandwidth available and then license it back into the telco system anyway, so that they can share in on it. And that's the way they've kept up their pace of data center growth while also, contributing to the overall network. Sir? Mm-hmm. It's the shark thing's a bit of a myth. In the early days of the telegraph cables, they were using organics, they're using pechacucha and stuff like that was actually somewhat tasty. So sea life was biting on the cables that way. There's also been an argument that sharks can sense electrical fields, and so the old electrical cables were attractive to them, so they might have been biting it for that reason, but it's largely not actually a thing. It's not the sea life that damages the cables. It's undersea movements, trawlers, although again, like, trawlers are bad. It's not a good way to fish. And so for the most part, people are getting rid of them. That don't happen as often anymore. But when they are trawling in pretty deep water, you're literally laying down this giant chain that scrapes the bottom of the ocean into a net and takes everything. It's clear cutting. And so they'll occasionally pick up cables that way. But that's happening less and less because people just don't do trawling anymore. It's like drift netting. It's just horrible for the ocean. You're destroying your own product in the process.
Hello.
Sir.
Thank you for the talk. I have a quick question. And the cable, they are buried next to the shore, but in the deep ocean, it's floating, or it's on the sea?
It's on the bottom.
On
Yeah, the cables don't float. They're completely solid, so that they don't care about pressure. They're filled with gel, and so yeah, they sit on the bottom.
Thank you.
So far, I only heard private.
Are there nation states that own the cables? Well, in the sense that telcos are often nation state tied. right? That you could say that nation states have a relationship with. Many countries only have a telco that is part, a private partnership or a state-owned entity, and so in that sense they do. There are military cables that are largely not talked about. There are huge networks of sonar sensors and so forth on the bottom that are used to keep track of submarines and things. So nations do lay them, but they don't talk about them. Any others? What did I miss from this? Anybody heard about hollow core fiber? It was very hip like a couple of months ago. They're starting to talk about hollow core fiber. So they've now gotten to a point where they can put a vacuum in the center of that glass tube to increase the speed of the cable. They just can't make it long enough for underwater, so they're not going to do that. It's purely for data connections within the data center so far. Hollow core fiber is kind of new and cool and hip. Just really, I have so much money, I want weird new fibers, but you're just, we don't need that kind of speed under the water. Like terabits seem impressive till you see the kind of speeds they're doing inside of data centers. Like lots of peta and exabyte transmission rates, like hugely fast, and we don't need that underwater yet. Not for now, anyway. Over here? Oh, here?
I've seen a HPC project with hollow, the vacuum, right? The network. I was just about to ask if you know the technology of the vacuum cables and the difference of them.
The hollow fiber?
Yes, that one.
The idea with hollow fiber is that you're now trying to move light through a vacuum. So your rate of speed, you can actually increase the data density in the multiplexer. So the fiber is effectively faster. But it's tricky stuff. It's a difficult cable to make. It's very expensive. We have limited lengths. So it's really meant to, for inter-rack communications at very high speeds. That's sort of the scale that they're working on right now. So it makes data centers faster for their work. It's not, I don't see it leaving buildings for now. There's a whole conversation about making more advanced fibers. It's one of the experiments they're starting to do in space is making crystalline fibers in free fall, in low gravity, because they grow the crystals better. As I want. Fibers from the moon. Question here?
Yeah, so about 15 years ago, I was working for investment banks, and they were doing arbitrage trading, and they had all these microwave relays across the ocean, so they could get the price changes before people get it from the cables. Is that something people still do, or has fiber got fast enough now that that's no longer an advantage?
Yeah, fiber's going to beat microwave relay. I mean, I've done both, but I'll tell you how messed up this situation's got. This is pretty messed up, and maybe I'll add this slide later if you guys want to. This is not undersea cable stuff. This is how weird you get with fiber. So listen, I am highly offended by this kind of quant trading. Back in the day, before electronic stock trading, when you wanted to buy a stock, you literally would call a broker who would call the floor to say, hey, I'm looking to buy 100 shares at IBM, I'll pay up to this much. And that person would literally take your request onto a pit and say, I've got 100, I'm looking for 100 IBM at this price. And somebody would say yes, and you'd make the trade, and then you'd get a call back, and it'd be done, right? If that person knew somebody else would pay more for that stock than what you were asking for, they could actually offer to buy it at the higher price and then sell it to you for more. Could buy it for a lower price and then charge you that price and pocket the difference. It's called front running. Right? I front run the trade. You're willing to buy it. You were willing to buy it 100. I found a guy that was willing to sell it to me for 90. I sell it to you. I buy it from him for 90 and then sell it to you for 100. I front run the deal. I go to prison. But if I do it through a fiber optic cable, somehow it's legal. So these guys, they pay a fee to the trading floor to run a perfectly straight fiber optic cable, like it has no bends in it, so that they can read the bids for orders milliseconds ahead of the trade being able to complete, so they can front run the sale. Right? Down to the milliseconds. It is front running, but because it's done electronically and you paid a subscription fee to the trading floor to have that service, somehow it's legal. But they literally, I talked to a guy who laid some of that fiber where they were shooting lasers down the tube that they're going to pull this fiber through, because any bends in it would slow down the transmission rate. right? They wanted the minimum number of reflections in the wire, and they were using single modal fiber. Remember when I showed you the really fine fiber? Single modal fiber is faster, right? It doesn't move as much data, but it's really, really quick. So he's laying single modal fiber under tension, perfectly straight cable underground between two buildings in New York to get to the stock floor. Messed up. This is not making things. This is the opposite of making things. This is putting a tax on stuff because you paid a fee to lay a straight piece of fiber. It's, yeah. I appreciate, once upon a time, we bought stocks because those companies needed money to do extraordinary things. And that's why you invested in that company, so they would take your money and build something new that would make more money. This trading thing has got nothing to do with that. This has got to do with, hey, it might go up tomorrow, so I'll buy it now and sell it tomorrow. You know, you're not helping to make anything. And this is the ultimate. The moment you're owning stock for milliseconds, really? Just to make a difference on it? But I'm not going to blame the fiber optic cable for that. All right, what else didn't I talk about in this story? I'll include the shark bit for sure. All right, folks, I hope that you enjoyed this. Thanks for your time. Have a great rest of the show. Thanks.
Nice job.